Good evening, community. It is a true pleasure to be with you once again, bringing you the most macabre and terrifying stories that reach us every week. If you would like to send in your story, our email is in the video description. We thank each person who continues to share their stories with us. Now, I invite you to turn off the lights and put on your headphones if you can. The most important thing is for you to let yourself be carried away by the upcoming stories. The night fell over the forest like a heavy blanket, muffling the sounds of life that once thrived among the trees. The soft crackling of the campfire was the only noise breaking the absolute silence, its flames casting dancing shadows on the treetops. He was alone in the heart of an untouched place, where the trees were ancient witnesses to forgotten secrets. The air was cold but pleasant, carrying with it the fresh scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. There was something almost sacred about that isolation, a peace that could only be found far from the chaos of civilization. The man sitting by the fire felt in harmony with his surroundings, as if he were finally where he was meant to be, far from everything and everyone, just him and nature. The forest was a labyrinth of shadows and faint lights where imagination could run wild. He had chosen this place for that very reason, to escape, to find himself, to feel what it was like to be truly alone. The sense of freedom was intoxicating. It was just him there, with the world around him, the world that seemed to bend in silent reverence to his presence. But there was something more in that solitude, something that whispered from the depths of the silence, something he couldn't identify. Sometimes his eyes caught subtle movements between the trees, shadows that seemed to move on their own. But whenever he looked directly, there was nothing there, only the sway of leaves in the gentle breeze. The cold began to intensify, and he moved closer to the fire, pulling his jacket tighter for warmth. It was getting late, and the stars began to twinkle in the sky, small jewels shining against the dark mantle of the night. He closed his eyes for a moment, listening to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat, feeling the solid earth beneath him. He was exactly where he wanted to be. But when he opened his eyes again, the sense of comfort had dissipated, replaced by a growing unease. Something had changed. The fire still burned, but the darkness around him seemed denser, more oppressive, as if the forest were closing in on him, watching him. In that instant, he realized that the solitude he had sought had a different face. It wasn't just an absence of people, but the presence of something much deeper, something that inhabited the shadows and the silence, something that had been there long before him, and perhaps wasn't willing to share that space. The night wore on, and the forest's cold seemed to seep into his bones, making the air around him almost tangible. The fire no longer offered the same comfort, its flames struggling against the encroaching darkness. He felt restless, a sensation he couldn't shake, as if something was out of place, as if the very air was charged with an invisible tension. While trying to convince himself it was just the effect of solitude, a soft sound captured his attention. A whisper, almost indistinct, as if the wind was trying to tell him a secret. He stood up, looking around, but there was no one, only the towering trees and the endless darkness. The sound could have been just the wind, but there was something about it that made him hesitate. It was a human sound, a distant murmur, like muffled voices conversing deep within the forest. He decided he needed to stretch his legs, perhaps to shake off the strange feeling enveloping him. Grabbing his flashlight, he walked around the campsite, his steps sinking into the soft earth covered with dry leaves. Every crunch underfoot seemed to echo louder than usual, as if he were stepping on something more than just twigs. Then he noticed a shadow moving at the edge of his vision. He swung the flashlight around quickly, but there was nothing, just trees and the surrounding darkness. His heart raced, but he forced himself to laugh, attributing it to his imagination. However, the laugh felt fragile, as if even he didn't believe his own attempt at comfort. Back at the campsite, the fire seemed smaller, the flames weaker. He sat down, trying to focus on the warmth, on the safety the fire should provide. But the whispers returned, louder this time, as if several voices were talking just beyond the circle of light. He stood up again, spinning the flashlight in all directions, but the voices stopped immediately. leaving only the oppressive silence. He felt like he was being watched, as if the forest had keen eyes observing his every move. The solitude that had once been comforting had transformed into something threatening, an isolation that left him vulnerable. He began to question his sanity, wondering if he was succumbing to irrational fears. But then, as he turned back toward the fire, he saw it again, the shadow among the trees, motionless, just watching. This time there was no ignoring it. The figure was there, silent, fused with the darkness, so indistinct it was impossible to define its features or intentions. And before he could decide whether to approach or flee, the shadow vanished, swallowed by the forest, leaving only the echo of what might have been a distant laugh. He stood still for a moment, trying to process what he had just seen, trying to find a rational explanation for the irrational. But the silence that followed was worse than any sound, a silence that seemed to scream the truth he didn't want to admit. He was no longer alone, and whatever accompanied him in the shadows was not human. The night had deepened into an impenetrable shroud, wrapping the forest in a silence that seemed alive, pulsating. The trees, which had once offered a sense of security and shelter, now resembled dark towers, guardians of ancient and dangerous secrets. The fire was dying, its flames weak and struggling to stay lit, as if they too felt the weight of the invisible presence hanging in the air. He sat near the fire, trying to ignore the growing feeling that something was about to happen. The wind, which had once whispered through the leaves, now seemed laden with whispers of unnatural origin. He could no longer distinguish whether it was the wind or human voices, but something inside him knew he shouldn't listen too closely. Perhaps they were the whispers of beings that didn't belong to this world, or maybe of people who, like him, had ventured into the forest and never returned. As he stared intently at the flames, he heard a sharp, distinct crack from somewhere nearby. His heart skipped a beat. It was the sound of a branch breaking, not by the force of nature, but by something walking, something with weight, something with purpose. He stood up slowly, his eyes scanning the darkness beyond the weak circle of light. Nothing moved, but he knew he was being watched. He felt the weight of those invisible eyes fixed on him, analyzing, waiting. More cracks, now coming from different directions. Something, or someone, was circling the camp. Cautious steps, almost inaudible, but undeniably present. He swung the flashlight, its beam cutting through the darkness like a blade, but all it revealed were tree trunks and deep shadows. The feeling of being surrounded intensified, an invisible pressure tightening his chest, making it hard to breathe. He decided to feed the fire, hoping the higher flames might drive away whatever was out there. But as he bent to gather more wood, he heard a laugh. Faint, distant, but filled with an indescribable malice. It wasn't a human laugh, but something distorted, like the echo of a terrible memory. He straightened up quickly, body tense, all his senses on high alert. The flashlight trembled in his hand, but he forced himself to keep the light steady. The footsteps grew louder, now clearly coming from all sides. Surrounded. He knew there was no denying it anymore. What had once been just a nagging feeling had transformed into a terrifying certainty. He was being hunted. The whispers mingled with the laughter, creating an insane cacophony that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. The campfire went out suddenly, as if an invisible hand had snuffed out the flames. He was left in complete darkness, with only the weak light of the flashlight illuminating the bare minimum, revealing trees that now seemed closer, more suffocating. The air was thick, almost impossible to breathe, as if the very night were alive and trying to swallow him. Then he saw them, figures emerging from the darkness, their bodies indistinct but their presence undeniable. They weren't entirely solid, their forms wavering between the tangible and the ethereal, like shadows that refused to be fully defined. Empty eyes glowed in the darkness, fixed on him, as if predators ready to strike. Fear paralyzed him for a moment, but the instinct to survive quickly took over. He tightened his grip on the flashlight and began to run, with no direction in mind, just fleeing, feeling the weight of the pursuit close behind. The footsteps were now clear, heavy, as if the shadows had solidified, become flesh. Laughter echoed in the trees, the sound of pure malice, as he ran through the forest with no destination, only trying to escape the inevitable. The night was no longer a refuge, but a prison where he was being hunted by something that didn't belong to this world, something that wanted him, not out of revenge or anger, but simply because he was there. The solitude he had sought had turned into absolute terror, and he knew in his heart that this night would not end like the others. He ran aimlessly through the forest, his feet barely touching the ground as fear pushed him onward. His heart pounded in his chest like a frantic drum, each pulse echoing in his ears, mingling with the sound of footsteps chasing him. The world around him became a blur of shadows and branches, an indistinct landscape where every tree looked identical to the one before, as if he were running in circles within a nightmare from which he couldn't wake. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps ceased, and silence fell over the forest like a crushing weight. He stopped, panting, trying to catch his breath and understand what had changed. The silence was so absolute it hurt his ears, an absence of sound that was worse than the constant noise before. He looked around, his eyes wide with adrenaline and terror, but he could see nothing but the deep shadows extending in every direction. And then they appeared. At first, they were indistinct shapes, figures that seemed to merge with the shadows, slowly emerging from the darkness around him. He could barely make out their faces, but there was something deeply wrong about them. Their bodies were thin, almost skeletal, covered in pale, translucent skin that didn't seem to belong to living beings. Their eyes, or what was left of them, were just dark holes, devoid of any trace of humanity. And their smiles, those thin, disturbing smiles stretched at impossible angles, filled with a malice that made his stomach churn. They didn't speak, but their presence screamed a clear intention. He had nowhere left to run. The figures closed in slowly, their movements in a sinister rhythm, as if they were dancing a macabre choreography, tightening the circle around him. Each step they took seemed to steal more of the warmth from the air, leaving the forest colder, more dead. He backed away, but with each step he took, the figures advanced a little more, until finally his back hit the trunk of a tree. There was nowhere left to go. He felt trapped, his fear turning into pure despair. He had to get out of there, he had to escape, but there was no way out, not with the figures so close, their empty eyes fixed on him as if they were studying him, savoring the moment. He tried to speak, to scream, anything to break the oppressive silence, but the words died in his throat, suffocated by terror. The figures stopped a few meters away, forming a perfect circle around him. And then, as one, they tilted their heads to the side in unison, as if they were listening to something he couldn't hear. In the midst of that nightmare, he had the feeling that they were waiting for something, perhaps a command. But from whom? From what? There was no sound in the forest, except for the rapid beating of his own heart and his ragged breathing, which seemed to echo in the darkness. The air was so thick it was hard to breathe, as if the world around him was closing in, squeezing him between the trees and those inhuman figures. He knew he had to do something, anything, but fear paralyzed him. Every movement he tried to make was like dragging his body through a nightmare of mud and shadows. Then, without warning, one of the figures stepped forward, extending a thin, bony hand toward him. The touch didn't come, but the gesture was enough to jolt him from his stupor. With a desperate cry, he threw himself to the side, trying to escape through the only space that seemed free. He ran with all his might, feeling the weight of the figures just behind him, the cold of their presence closing in like a wave of ice. He didn't look back. He knew that if he did, he would see those empty eyes chasing him, getting closer, ever more hungry. But the forest seemed endless. He ran and ran, but the trees were always the same, the terrain unchanged, as if he were trapped in a labyrinth that refused to let him escape. And in the distance, he could still hear the sound of footsteps, the echo of distant laughter that made his mind falter. He was trapped. No matter how fast he ran, he knew he couldn't escape. Desperation drove him to keep running. Even when his legs felt like lead, and each breath was a sharp knife in his lungs. The darkness around him seemed denser, as if the forest itself were conspiring to keep him trapped, suffocating any hope of escape. The trees formed an endless labyrinth, and he felt as if he were running in circles, always returning to the same place, always under the watchful gaze of those empty eyes that pursued him. But then something changed. The darkness ahead seemed to part, revealing a clearing. He stumbled toward it, his heart hammering in his chest, expecting it to be just another illusion, another trap of the forest. But as he emerged from the trees, the clearing was real. The space was surrounded by ancient trees, their twisted branches forming a natural dome that blocked the view of the starry sky. In the center was a formation of stones arranged in a circle, like an ancient altar forgotten by time. Panting, he approached, the faint light of his flashlight illuminating the ground in front of him. It was then that he saw the signs, remnants of past camps, forgotten there like the traces of other people who, like him, had ventured into the forest and never returned. There were torn backpacks, scattered clothes, and personal items that seemed to have been abandoned in haste. But what caught his attention was the symbol carved into the central stone, an old and deep mark as if it had been engraved centuries ago. The mark was a tangled web of lines and curves, forming a symbol he didn't recognize, but which emanated a palpable sense of malice. He moved closer, his eyes fixed on the symbol, trying to understand its meaning. That's when, like a whisper from the depths of his mind, the revelation began to take shape. This place wasn't just a simple campsite, not just a passing point. It was a place of sacrifice, a place where long before he arrived, dark rituals had been performed, rituals that sealed a pact between the world of the living and something that existed beyond the borders of reality. Those figures that pursued him weren't just ghosts or apparitions, but guardians of an eternal cycle of sacrifice and pain. As he examined the clearing, a deep sense of dread settled in his chest. The stories about the forest were more than just legends. They were warnings. The voices that whispered in the winds, the shadows that moved on their own, were all signs that he had been chosen, that the forest had decided his fate the moment he set foot there. The clearing, with its stone altar and cursed symbol, was the heart of the cycle, the place where all those who had been hunted before him had ended. And now, he was there, surrounded with no escape, the next offering meant to appease the entities that inhabited the shadows. Suddenly, everything became clear. The only way to escape, the only way to break the cycle, was through a sacrifice. But not just any sacrifice. It had to be a voluntary one, a choice between his own life and the eternal damnation of those who would come after him. He understood with a chilling clarity that the cycle could only be broken if he surrendered, if he accepted his fate and offered his life as payment. But even as this revelation unfolded in his mind, the presence of the figures around him intensified. He could feel their empty eyes, their skeletal hands outstretched, waiting for him to make his decision. And as fear transformed into resigned terror, he knew deep in his soul that there was no other choice. He was trapped in a destiny sealed long before his arrival, and the only way out was to accept the truth the forest had revealed to him. The cold of the revelation quickly dissipated, replaced by a wave of panic. The idea of surrendering to those figures, of sacrificing himself to appease the entities that inhabited the forest, was unbearable. The survival instinct that had been held in check by fear exploded within him with overwhelming force. He wasn't going to surrender so easily. If the forest wanted a sacrifice, it would have to fight for it. He backed away from the stone altar, his mind racing as he searched for a way to escape. He knew the figures were still there, in the shadows around the clearing, waiting, watching. He could feel their presence like a physical pressure in the air, but that only fueled his determination. He grabbed the knife he carried in his backpack, the blade reflecting the faint light of the flashlight. It was a small weapon, a survival tool, not meant for combat, but it was all he had. With the knife in one hand and the flashlight in the other, he began to walk around the clearing, his eyes scanning the darkness, trying to anticipate the next movement of the figures. With each step, the tension increased, as if the very air were vibrating with the malignant energy that permeated the place. He knew he couldn't trust his senses, that the forest was distorting his perception, but he had no choice but to keep moving forward. Suddenly, one of the figures emerged from the shadows, silent as a ghost, moving with unnatural grace. It advanced, its hand outstretched toward him, its empty eyes fixed on him. Without thinking, he slashed the air with the knife, swinging it with all his strength. The blade passed through the figure as if it were smoke, offering no resistance, and he nearly lost his balance. A cold, joyless laugh echoed through the clearing, reverberating through the trees like a funeral bell. He spun toward the sound, only to see more figures approaching, closing in, each one closer than the last. Their twisted smiles and dark eyes were a constant reminder that he was in a place where the rules of the real world didn't apply. He struck again, this time with more force, driven by desperation. The knife cut through another figure, and once again it dissolved into the air, only to reappear a few steps away, untouched. With each strike, the truth became clearer. He couldn't harm them, couldn't drive them away with physical force. These weren't bodies that could be hurt. They were shadows, materialized nightmares, and he was powerless against them. But the struggle wasn't just physical. The forest was testing his mind, eroding his determination, trying to convince him that there was no way out. The feeling of suffocation intensified, as if the trees were closing in on him, tightening the circle around the clearing. The darkness seemed to pulse, alive, breathing with him, following his steps, waiting for him to make a mistake. But he wouldn't give up. With each new attack from the figures, he retreated, searching for a way out, a gap in the darkness that surrounded him. His heart pounded, his breathing ragged, but his mind remained focused, clinging to the last spark of hope. He knew he couldn't defeat them directly, but maybe he could find a way to outsmart them, to use the very nature of the forest against them. With every move, he tried to recall the details of the ancient tales he had heard about cursed places, about rituals and sacrifices. There was always a way to break the cycle, to escape fate. And then, amid the terror, a thought emerged. The clearing, the altar, the symbol. Perhaps what he needed wasn't to fight the figures directly, but to use the power of the altar itself to turn the tables. He ran toward the altar, his heart racing, the figures now almost touching his back. He reached the central stone, kneeling before the carved symbol. The idea was insane, but he had no other choice. He pressed his hand against the symbol, feeling the cold stone beneath his skin, and began to mutter words he didn't fully understand, words that came from a deep place in his mind, as if they were memories from a past life. The figures stopped suddenly, as if hesitating, and he felt the pressure around him ease slightly. He kept muttering, his voice trembling but steady. The flashlight flickered, almost going out, and the darkness around him stirred, as if reacting to what he was doing. The forest seemed to vibrate, an intense and ancient energy coursing through the ground, the trees, the air. Then a burst of light emanated from the altar, momentarily blinding him. The figures recoiled, emitting sounds that resembled distant screams, as if they were being dragged back into the shadows from which they came. He felt the warmth of the light envelop his body, burning away the cold that had gripped him. When the light faded, he was alone in the clearing. The figures were gone, swallowed by the darkness, and the symbol on the stone seemed to have lost its power, now just a tangled web of lines worn down by time. He was panting, his body exhausted but alive. The forest, though still shrouded in shadows, seemed less oppressive, as if it had retreated, as if it had lost part of its power. But he knew he wasn't safe, not yet. The struggle had given him a chance, but the forest still wanted him. And he needed to get out of there before the darkness regained its strength, before the strangers returned to finish what they had started. He was exhausted, every muscle in his body crying out for rest, but the persistent terror drove him to continue. He knew that what had happened in the clearing was not a complete victory. The light that emanated from the altar had temporarily driven the strangers away, but the forest still pulsed with a dark energy, an ancient power that would not be easily defeated. He needed to leave, but something pulled him back to the altar, as if part of him knew there was more to be discovered. Kneeling before the central stone, with the symbol still visible, though weakened, he began to examine the details around him. The stones surrounding the altar were arranged in a way that seemed intentional, forming a pattern he hadn't noticed before. A pattern of convergence, all paths leading to the center, to the symbol he had touched. That's when he noticed another inscription, almost invisible in the dim light, carved at the base of the stone, half buried in earth and moss. He cleaned the surface with trembling hands, slowly revealing words that appeared to be in an ancient language, a mixture of symbols and characters he didn't recognize. But as his fingers traced the inscriptions, the words began to make sense in his mind, as if being translated by a force beyond his understanding. The message was clear, though terrifying. The sacrifice was necessary, but it wasn't just a simple blood sacrifice. To break the cycle, someone had to offer themselves, body and soul, not only to the forest, but to become part of it. What the strangers wanted, what the entities that inhabited that place demanded, was a soul that accepted the burden of maintaining the balance between worlds. It was a price no one before him had been willing to pay, a price he now understood in all its terrible magnitude. The symbol on the altar was the key. When he had pressed his hand against it, he had triggered a reaction, a connection between himself and the forest, something the other sacrifices hadn't managed to do. Those who had come before had tried to resist, to fight, to escape, but none of them had understood the true purpose of the sacrifice. It required more than just offering life. It demanded the surrender of one's essence, an act of total submission. He began to feel the weight of what lay before him. To save himself, to break the cycle, and prevent others from falling into the same trap, he would have to surrender completely. Fear gripped him, but there was also a strange calm, an acceptance that began to grow within him. He knew there was no real escape. Even if he managed to flee, the forest would find him, and the strangers would hunt him down to the ends of the earth. By accepting the sacrifice, he wouldn't just free his own soul, but also the souls of those who had been captured before him. The clearing, with its ancient altar, was a point of convergence, a passage between worlds. Those who sacrificed themselves here didn't just die. They became part of the forest itself, integrated into the darkness, part of the delicate balance between the world of the living and the dead. He stood, feeling the weight of the decision he was about to make. The clearing around him seemed more alive than before, as if the trees and the earth were waiting, watching. The strangers did not appear again, but he knew they were there, lurking, waiting for him to accept his fate. With the knife still in hand, he approached the altar, the ancient words echoing in his mind. He knew what needed to be done, and although the terror of surrendering to the forest was immense, there was also a strange peace in knowing that his sacrifice could finally put an end to the cycle of horror. He raised the knife, the blade gleaming faintly in the lantern's light, and took a deep breath. It would not be an easy end, but it would be a necessary one. And with the final acceptance of his fate, he understood that the true sacrifice was not just of his life, but of his soul, a price he was willing to pay to break the curse that had trapped so many others. With a firm motion, he cut the palm of his hand and pressed the warm blood against the symbol on the altar, feeling an intense, ancient energy envelop his body. The pain was immediate, but there was also a strange relief, as if the forest were finally accepting his offering. And as the darkness around him closed in, as his consciousness was pulled towards something beyond this world, he knew he had done what needed to be done. The cycle was broken. The forest now had its sacrifice. And he finally found peace in total surrender, as the night enveloped everything in its eternal shroud. The darkness closed in around him like a cold, implacable embrace. The sacrifice was complete. He felt the energy flowing from his cut hand into the symbol on the altar, as if the forest itself were drinking from his life, absorbing his essence. The pain was intense, but there was a strange peace and acceptance, as if he had finally found his place in the vast tapestry of horrors that permeated that place. But then something unexpected happened. Instead of being consumed by the darkness, he felt a wave of heat sweep through his body, radiating from the altar to every part of his soul. The symbol beneath his hand began to glow, emitting a soft light that contrasted with the blackness around him. He felt the earth tremble slightly beneath his feet, as if the forest was responding to his offering, but not in the way he had expected. Rather than being swallowed by the darkness, he was enveloped by light. It was as if the forest were accepting his sacrifice, but also offering something in return, a kind of redemption, or perhaps a final test. The light intensified, expanding beyond the clearing, illuminating the trees around him, bathing everything in a pale, ethereal glow. The figures that had surrounded him, the strangers who had relentlessly pursued him, began to retreat, their spectral bodies fading into the light. They didn't scream, didn't fight, they simply disappeared, like shadows dissipated by the dawn. With the departure of the figures, the forest seemed to breathe again, as if an ancient weight had been lifted, a curse finally broken. He collapsed to his knees, the knife slipping from his hand and falling onto the moss-covered ground. He felt light, almost as if he were floating, the pain replaced by a profound sense of relief. But along with the relief came uncertainty. What would happen next? Was the forest freeing him, or was this just the prelude to something even worse? The light around him began to fade, returning to the familiar darkness of the night. But this darkness was no longer oppressive, no longer alive with the threat of the strangers. It was simply the calm, quiet night, as it should be. He looked around, still expecting something to emerge from the shadows, but all he found was the peaceful swaying of the trees in the wind. Finally, he stood, staggering slightly, still dizzy from the experience. The altar, which had once pulsed with malignant energy, now appeared to be just a simple stone, worn down by time, the symbol almost invisible on its surface. The clearing was empty, except for him, and the sensation of being watched had completely vanished. He began walking away from the clearing, with no clear direction, simply following the instinct to leave that place. The forest, once a labyrinth of terror, now seemed almost welcoming. The trees no longer resembled threatening towers, but silent companions watching him pass by. After some time, he found a trail that seemed familiar. He followed it, his steps firm despite his exhaustion. The night was calm, and for a moment, he allowed himself to believe that it was all over, that he was free. But when he finally reached the edge of the forest, where the first lights of civilization flickered in the distance, he stopped and looked back. The forest was quiet, but there was something in the air, a vague, almost imperceptible sensation. It wasn't a threat, but a presence, as if something were watching him from afar, waiting. It was then that he realized the truth. Yes, he had broken the cycle, but the price had been his connection to the forest. Part of him now belonged to that place and always would. He was free to leave, to resume his life, but he would never be the same. There was a piece of his soul, a small but vital part, that would remain in that altar, in that clearing, forever tied to the darkness he had faced. And so, with a mix of relief and melancholy, he left the forest behind, knowing that although he had escaped, a part of him would always be condemned to walk among the shadows, guarding the secrets of that place. At the edge of the road, he encountered another camper, a solitary figure walking toward the forest with a backpack and a curious expression on his face. They exchanged a brief glance, and something deep in the stranger's eyes made him stop. A reflection, perhaps, or a silent recognition. But he said nothing. He simply nodded and continued on his way, leaving the new camper to follow his own path into the darkness. And as he walked back into the light, a soft shadow passed over his face, a final reminder of what he had faced. Perhaps the forest would never truly let him go. Perhaps he was doomed to carry a piece of it with him wherever he went. But at least for now, he was free. Or so he hoped. It was a dark and silent night when I sat by the campfire to tell a story that has haunted my family for generations. My father, a man of few words and many secrets, once shared with me an experience he lived through 20 years ago during a mission he could never forget. At the time, he was a fearless young soldier, full of vigor, but what he encountered that night in the mountains forever changed his view of the world. As he told me the story, his eyes revealed a deep fear, something I had never seen in him before. It wasn't the ordinary fear of someone who had faced danger, but the terror of one who had witnessed the inexplicable. He and his comrades had been sent to a remote area where the wind howled fiercely, and the silence was almost deafening. Their task was simple: investigate an abandoned cornfield. But nothing about that mission was simple. As the night fell, something sinister began to manifest in the air, something none of them were prepared to face. What he saw, what he heard, what all of them felt in that darkness. My father told me it was not of this world. But what really happened that night? I will tell you, but prepare yourself, because after hearing this story, you too will never be the same. When my father and the other soldiers arrived at the site, the sun was already setting, casting long shadows over the cornfield. The field stretched as far as the eye could see, with perfect rows of tall plants swaying gently in the wind. But there was something wrong, something none of them could quite define. It was as if the very air was charged with a heavy, suffocating energy, and the silence, oh, the silence was the worst of all. The birds weren't singing, the insects weren't buzzing. Only the restless rustling of the corn leaves, like indecipherable whispers, accompanied every move the soldiers made. My father felt a chill down his spine, a foreboding he couldn't shake, but he pressed on. The mission was clear: investigate the area and report any anomalies. They set up camp near the edge of the field, deciding it would be safer to wait until dawn to explore more carefully. The beams from their flashlights cut through the darkness, but did nothing to dispel the feeling that they were being watched. Every sound they made seemed to echo back, amplified by the emptiness surrounding them. As the night finally enveloped them, the darkness brought with it a growing unease. My father took turns with the others to keep watch over the camp, but something inside him told him this night would be different from the others. He looked up at the starry sky, trying to find comfort in the vastness above, but all he felt was the weight of the unknown pressing down on them like an invisible shadow. As he sat there, his back to the cornfield, he didn't know that it would be the last time he'd see the world the same way. The true mission would begin in the next few hours, and what he was about to encounter would haunt him for the rest of his life. The night dragged on slowly, each minute crawling by with increasing tension. My father was on his watch when he heard the first sound. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, like something moving among the rows of corn. He stood up slowly, his eyes fixed on the darkness of the field, trying to discern what was happening. The rustling of the leaves grew more intense, as if something was stalking through the plants, getting closer. He turned on his flashlight, sweeping the beam of light across the field, but all he saw were the shadows of the leaves dancing in the wind. Yet, the sound persisted, now closer, more urgent. My father called the others, and together they tried to identify the source of those noises. But whatever was out there was too fast and too quiet to be seen, like a shadow slipping through the darkness. Then the phenomena began. The compasses, which had been steady until then, started spinning wildly in their hands, as if north no longer existed. The radios, which kept the group in constant communication, began emitting nothing but static, a sharp noise that seemed to penetrate their very bones. But the worst of all was the sensation, that invisible presence that now made itself felt more strongly. It was as if the air around them was alive, pulsing with a malevolent energy, something that shouldn't be there, something not of this world. My father felt fear grip him, an emotion he rarely experienced. They were surrounded by a force they couldn't see, something that toyed with their minds, and even though they were armed to the teeth, they felt powerless in the face of the unknown. The noises continued, sometimes to the left, sometimes to the right, always moving, always out of reach. Then, in a moment of absolute silence, they all heard it. A deep, guttural sound, like the roar of a creature that didn't belong to the earth. It was brief, but enough to freeze the blood in their veins. They were not alone in that cornfield. Something was watching them. Something was hunting them. And in that instant, my father knew they had entered a territory where the rules of the world they knew no longer applied. When dawn finally began to brighten the sky, bringing a bit of relief to the group, the soldiers heard footsteps approaching along the path. It was the other platoon that should have joined them the previous night. But instead of seeing relieved faces, my father saw in their eyes an expression he knew well: terror. The leader of the other group, a man usually calm and confident, was pale with trembling hands. He began to recount what had happened to them during the night. They had gotten lost in the mountain trails, something strange as they knew the area well. A fog had risen from nowhere, swallowing everything around them and confusing their senses. Then, in the middle of that dense fog, they saw two figures ahead. They were women, dressed in old-fashioned clothes, as if they had stepped out of another time. They seemed to float more than walk, their feet barely touching the ground. Without a word, they pointed to a path, a shortcut that should lead them back to the camp. The group's leader hesitated, suspicious, but the women seemed so serene, so certain of what they were doing, that he decided to follow their directions. The path they showed was not on any of the maps they carried, but inexplicably, it led them right back to their comrades. When they turned to thank the women, they were no longer there. They had vanished into the fog as mysteriously as they had appeared. What disturbed my father and the others wasn't just the story itself, but the way it was told. These men, hardened by war, were trembling, their voices faltering as they described the women. It was as if the simple act of remembering had the power to bring back the horror they had felt. As the sun rose, everyone knew something wasn't right. The cornfield, which should have been just a curiosity, now felt like a trap, a place where the laws of reality were distorted. And those women, who or what were they? Protectors? Guardians of an ancient secret? Or something even more sinister? The group was divided between the desire to leave immediately and the duty to complete the mission. But one thing was certain: no one wanted to be there when night fell again. With the arrival of morning, the sunlight brought a false sense of security to the group. However, the tension was palpable, and the strange occurrences of the previous night still loomed over everyone like a dark cloud. They gathered to discuss the next step, but the decision was not easy. The story of the two mysterious women, along with the inexplicable noises and the terrifying presence in the field, had broken everyone's spirits. The group was divided. Some wanted to abandon the mission, return to the base, and leave that cursed place behind. Others, driven by a sense of duty, insisted they should at least explore a little more before making any decision. But deep down, they all knew they were on the edge, that the cornfield held secrets they were not prepared to uncover. Finally, the decision was made. They would follow the path indicated by the mysterious women, hoping it would lead them to safety. Without further hesitation, they began to break camp, preparing to leave. As they moved away from the field, the sense of relief was almost immediate. The strange phenomena began to diminish, and the oppressive atmosphere that surrounded them seemed to dissipate with every step. During the return journey, however, silence reigned. No one dared speak about what had happened, as if putting it into words would somehow give more power to the unknown. My father, who had always been a man of few words, never forgot what he saw and heard that night, but he knew that reporting everything at the base would be useless. Who would believe them? Tales of unknown creatures and ghostly women would be easily dismissed as the hallucinations of tired soldiers. When they finally arrived at the base, the faces of the officers were a mix of disbelief and concern. The official versions of the events were simplified, omitting the most disturbing details. The mission was considered a technical success, but those who participated knew they had faced something far beyond the ordinary. My father carried that experience with him for the rest of his life. He was never the same after that night, and the other soldiers who were there weren't either. Whenever he spoke of what happened, there was a shadow in his eyes, a darkness that even time couldn't erase. And as for the women and the creature that roamed the field, they were never seen again, at least not by those who dared return to that region. But the stories continued, passed from mouth to mouth, warning those who might consider venturing into those lands. It wasn't just a legend. It wasn't just a soldier's tale. It was a warning, a reminder that there are forces in this world beyond our comprehension, and that some places should simply be left alone. As my father finished telling this story, the silence that followed was almost as heavy as the darkness he had described. He looked at me, his tired eyes revealing more than words could express. I had never seen that look before, a mixture of fear, respect, and acceptance of the unknown. He didn't need to say anything more. I knew that this experience had shaped the man he had become, and that, in some way, he was passing this burden on to me. Since that night, my father avoided talking about the mission. What happened in that cornfield remained buried deep in his memory, like a wound that never healed. He left me with a piece of advice I will never forget. There are places in this world that were not made for us, places where the rules are different, where the impossible becomes real. If you ever find yourself in a place like that, listen to the whispers of the wind and follow your instincts. because sometimes the only safe path is to walk away and never look back. This story is not just about what he experienced, but a warning to all of us. The world is vast and mysterious, and there are things out there that escape our understanding. My father and his comrades were witnesses to something that defies logic, and they learned the hard way that the unknown should not be underestimated. So if you ever find yourself in a place where the silence is deafening, where the shadows seem to move on their own, remember what you've heard here. Not all stories have explanations, and not all paths should be followed. Some things simply do not belong to our world. It was already past midnight when I decided to take a shortcut through that deserted street. The silence of the night seemed to swallow everything around, and the chill running up my spine wasn't just due to the cold wind. I had always been a skeptic, never believed in ghost stories or entities, but something that night made me question all my certainties. The kindergarten stood at the end of the street, with its rusty gates and swings that creaked with the slightest breeze. I had walked by that place hundreds of times, but at that moment, something seemed different, wrong. A barely perceptible sound cut through the silence. Laughter. Childish laughter echoing in the void. I stopped, trying to find a rational explanation. Perhaps children playing, I thought. But the idea was absurd. Who would be there at that hour? Still, I kept walking, each step heavier than the last, each shadow around me seeming more threatening. When I passed the gate, the sound ceased abruptly, leaving only an oppressive void. I took a deep breath and moved forward, but I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something or someone watching me from the shadows, waiting. And it was at that moment, as my footsteps echoed on the empty sidewalk, that something inside me changed forever. After that unsettling night, I tried to continue with my routine, convinced that it was all just a trick of my tired mind. But as night fell, the tension returned, even stronger. That sound of children's laughter echoed in my memory, growing clearer each time. I tried to push the thought away, to focus on anything else, but it was useless. One night, as I prepared to sleep, a faint noise made me freeze. Something had fallen in the living room. I went there, expecting to find a logical explanation, maybe a poorly placed object that had slid. But everything was in its place. Yet, the sensation of being watched was undeniable. Something was there with me, but it wouldn't reveal itself. The noises continued, becoming more frequent, and a strange sense of presence began to follow me around the house. It was as if a shadow trailed me, always lurking but never fully showing itself. My nerves were on edge, and sleep, once a refuge, became hostile territory. That same week, it happened for the first time. I woke in the middle of the night, completely paralyzed. My eyes were open, but my body was immobile. I could feel the weight of the air around me, dense and suffocating, and then I saw it, an indistinct shadow standing in the corner of the room, watching me. It had no defined form, but its presence was undeniable, terrifying. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. All I could do was stare at that figure, hoping it would disappear. When I finally managed to move, the shadow had vanished, but the fear remained, more real than ever. At that moment, I knew I wasn't alone, and that something from another world, had followed me from that night at the kindergarten. The following nights became a silent torture. Every time the sun set, the house seemed to transform into a strange, hostile place. The shadows on the walls seemed to stretch longer than normal, as if trying to envelop me, to swallow me. And always, there was that feeling that I was not alone. I began to notice small things, details that at first seemed insignificant. Objects that shifted places, lights that flickered without reason, doors that I was sure I had closed suddenly open. I tried to convince myself that it was my mind playing tricks, but the more I tried to ignore it, the more intense things became. Sleep paralysis became a constant visitor, a presence waiting for the right moment to strike. At first, I woke in silent panic, paralyzed, but over time things worsened. I wasn't just trapped in my own body. I was aware of the shadow. It came every night, closer each time, clearer with each visit. Now I could see its outlines, its distorted form. I could feel its icy breath on my face, the weight of its presence on my chest. I tried to resist, to keep my sanity, but with each episode, the shadow seemed stronger, more real. I knew I couldn't continue like this. My fear grew, and with it, the shadow seemed to gain more power, more substance. Every night was a battle that I knew I was losing, and the dread of what might happen if I completely lost control became unbearable. It was then that I realized I needed help, that this wasn't something I could face alone. Something malevolent had latched onto me, and I was losing the fight. I needed to find someone who understood, someone who could save me from what relentlessly pursued me. Desperation took hold of me. Each night was a battle against a darkness I couldn't face alone. I knew that something malevolent had infiltrated my life, something that didn't belong to this world. The shadows, the paralysis, the constant feeling of being watched, all pointed to the fact that I was being hunted by a force that fed on my fear. It was then, during a casual conversation, that I heard about a woman with spiritual gifts. They said she had helped others, people who had faced the unexplainable, the supernatural. I didn't know if I believed it, but the idea that someone might understand what I was going through, and maybe even help, was the only hope I had. I found her in a simple house, far from the city, where the air felt heavier, as if the very environment was aware of the energies she manipulated. When I entered, she looked at me with a calmness that made me feel I was in the right place. Without needing me to say a word, she seemed to understand what was haunting me. With a soft but authoritative voice, she explained that what I was facing was a malevolent entity, drawn to my fear that night at the kindergarten. This thing had fed on my uncertainties, my fears, growing stronger with each night I spent in panic. She told me that to rid myself of this shadow, I would need to perform a ritual. But she warned that it wouldn't be easy. The ritual would require me to face my worst fears, to confront head-on what had been haunting me. She began the preparations, tracing ancient symbols on the floor, lighting candles that cast flickering shadows on the walls, and burning herbs whose thick aroma filled the air. Each step seemed to fill the room with palpable energy, a force that both attracted and terrified me. And there, in the middle of that strange and mystical scene, I knew I was about to face the entity that had turned my life into an endless nightmare. The room around me seemed to compress as the spiritual woman continued her preparations. The candles flickered, casting shadows that danced on the walls like living entities. The smell of the burning herbs was suffocating, and the air was charged with a heavy, almost tangible energy. I was at the center of a ritual that promised to confront the evil pursuing me, but fear clung to me with sharp claws. The woman began chanting in a language I didn't understand, but the words vibrated within me, resonating in places I didn't know existed. The warmth from the candles contrasted with the sudden chill that overtook the room. It was as if an invisible door had opened, and something from the other side was watching. Suddenly, the environment around me began to change. The shadows became denser, almost solid, and I could feel the presence approaching. It was there, in the darkness, waiting, lurking. The woman continued the ritual, her voice now an anchor that kept me grounded in reality. But I knew the entity was manifesting, growing stronger with every passing second. Then I saw it. The shadow that had been haunting me rose before me, a distorted and undefined form, but undeniably real. It moved slowly, as if savoring my terror. My whole body trembled, and the fear I felt was unlike anything I had ever experienced. I knew I was at the edge. This was the moment when everything would be decided. Sensing the imminent confrontation, the woman intensified her chanting. The sound reverberated through the walls, seeming to push the entity back. I felt the air around me vibrate, as if two immense forces were battling for control of the space. The shadow hesitated, as if it were being repelled, but then it advanced again, more fiercely. It was at that moment that the woman did something I will never forget. She placed a firm hand on my shoulder, and I felt a wave of warmth and energy surge through me. It was as if she had transferred part of her strength to me, and in that moment, something shifted inside me. The fear that had once dominated me began to dissipate, replaced by a fierce determination. With a final shout, the woman completed the ritual, and the room exploded in blinding light. The shadow twisted, emitting a soundless scream, and then, like smoke in the wind, it dissolved. The air became light again, and the silence, which had once been terrifying, now brought a sense of peace. I knew the entity had been banished, sent back to wherever it came from. The presence that had tormented me was gone, and for the first time in weeks, I felt truly free. But when I looked at the woman, I saw in her eyes a silent warning. Fear is a door, and if I allowed it to return, the entity could find a way back to me. I had won this battle, but the war with my own fear was far from over. The days following the ritual were strangely calm. The house, which once felt like a battleground, now became a sanctuary of silence and peace. The shadows returned to being just shadows, and the sleep paralysis became a distant memory, like a nightmare that loses its grip upon waking. I could finally breathe, sleep, and exist without the constant sensation of being watched by something malevolent. Yet, despite the relief, a part of me couldn't fully relax. The spiritual woman's warning echoed in my mind. Fear, she had said, is a door. I knew the entity had been banished but not destroyed. It was out there, somewhere, waiting for the smallest weakness to return. I tried to move on, to live my life as I had before, but the experience had changed me. I was no longer the same person who had once walked through that kindergarten so carelessly. Now I knew the world was far more vast and terrifying than I had ever imagined, full of things we couldn't see but that could undoubtedly see us. What remained was vigilance. I knew I couldn't allow fear to regain control of my life, for it was the key to reopening that dark door. Every time a shadow moved strangely or a noise echoed in the night, I felt the familiar chill down my spine. But now, instead of succumbing to the terror, I took a deep breath and remembered who I was, who I had become. The battle had been won, but the war was far from over. And as long as fear stayed at bay, the shadow would remain banished, a memory buried in the depths of the night. But I knew, deep down, that it was never too far away, always lurking, waiting for me to make the mistake of opening the door once again.